Have you ever loved another person so much that not even their death would keep you from them? You're listening to Chalk Outline. I'm Cody, and I'm here to tell you the story of Carl Tanzler and his corpse bride of 7 years. Carl Tanzler was born on February 8th, 1877 in Dresden, Germany. Not much is known about his life prior to the Great War, so let's start the story when Carl made his move to Australia. Tanzler had traveled to Australia with all intentions to continue on to the South Seas Islands, but ended up pausing there for longer than expected, collecting equipment and becoming acquainted with the weather and the sea conditions before heading out on his boat. While there, Carl became interested in engineering and electrical work, and ended up buying property, boats, an organ, and even an island in the Pacific. After all was said and done, he ended up staying roughly 10 years in Australia. That doesn't seem much of a pass-through visit, does it? Just after starting his project of building a trans-ocean flyer, the Great War broke out, and the British military placed him in a camp for quote-unquote safekeeping. Tanzler would later be moved to Trial Bay Jail, a prison and internment camp built into the side of the cliffs on the edge of New South Wales. It was here Carl intended to build a sailboat and escape, but these plans never worked out as intended. And after the war, none of the prisoners were able to return to their formal residences and were instead shipped to the prisoners' exchange in Holland. After his release, he set out to find his mother in Germany, whom he had not seen since the start of the war. Carl found that his mother was safe and remained with her for 3 years. During his stay, Carl met Doris Schaefer. Shortly after that, the two married and had 2 children. Ayesha Tanzler, who would live a long life until 1998, and Clarissa Tanzler, who would die at the young age of 10 from diphtheria. Carl's mother suggested that he move to the United States and reunite with his sister, who emigrated and lived in Zephyrhills, Florida. Leaving on February 6, 1926, on a ship from Rotterdam to Havana, Cuba, Carl started the next chapter of his life. He quickly went from Cuba to Zephyrhills, Florida to reunite with his sister, and shortly following behind was his wife and 2 daughters. Sadly, Tanzler would leave his family behind after about a year and relocate to Key West, Florida, to take up a job as a radiology technician at the U.S. Marine Hospital. Before we go any further, it should be noted that earlier in Carl's childhood, he traveled briefly to Genoa, Italy, where he claims to have been visited by visions of the dead. Someone that claimed to be an ancestor by the name of Countess Anna Constantia von Kosel would reveal the face of his true love to him, an exotic, dark-haired woman. Whether this was a strange dream that happened to influence Carl later in life, or a real visit from the dead that showed him his preordained destiny, that's up for you to decide. But in fact, on April 22nd, 1930, Carl Tanzler met Maria Elena Malagro de Hoyos. The dead had indeed seemed to guide him to the love of his life. Tanzler was working at the hospital when Elena was brought in by her mother for examination, where she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which was typically fatal at the time, and had also claimed the life of most of her immediate family members. Tanzler took personal interest in saving her inside and out of the hospital. But despite his best efforts of trying wide varieties of medicines, bringing medical equipment to her home, and showering her with gifts like jewelry to boost her spirits, Elena passed away on October 25th, 1931. There are no records indicating that Carl and Elena had an actual relationship before her death, though there are records and statements of his generosity, but her reciprocity is unknown. Following her death, Tanzler paid all of the funeral costs and asked permission from Elena's parents to commission the construction of an above-ground mausoleum in the Key West Cemetery. Francisco and Aurora, Elena's parents, granted Tanzler permission, so the mausoleum was built, and this is where Carl would come to visit her almost every night, sometimes serenading her with her favorite Spanish songs. During one of his visits to the mausoleum, Tanzler was yet again visited by visions of the dead. This time it was Elena giving him instructions to take her from her grave. So that's what Carl Tanzler did one evening in April of 1933. He crept through the cemetery to Elena's mausoleum, extracted her body, and loaded it onto a toy wagon to cart her back to his home. Carl would end up jumping through hoops to keep the body in the condition that he wanted and to further prevent decay. Starting with her bones and her eyes, Tanzler used piano wire to hold her bones together, and he would replace her eyes with glass replicas. Then he proceeded to stuff her abdomen and chest cavity full of rags to retain her shape. As her skin started to decay, Carl would replace it with silk cloth that was dipped in wax and plaster of Paris, making Elena feel more like a crafts project than a human corpse. Naturally, her scalp would decay, making her hair fall out, so Carl would collect her hair in order to make her a wig. To top it all off, she would mostly stay in his bed, wearing stockings, gloves, and assorted jewelry. Copious amounts of perfume, disinfectants, and other preserving agents were used in order to thwart the smell and further decomposition of Elena's body. I'll take this time to remind you that Carl lived with Elena's corpse for 7 years. Summertime must have been rough. Eventually, rumors surfaced about Carl being in possession of Elena's body, and even a report of someone seeing him dancing in front of an open window with her. So in October 1940, Elena's sister Florinda confronted Tanzler about these rumors and proceeded to notify the authorities. The authorities did in fact find Elena's corpse and arrested Carl Tanzler. Upon his psychiatric examination, he was found to be mentally competent to stand trial on the charge of, quote, wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. A preliminary hearing on October 9th, 1940 was held at the Monroe County Courthouse in Key West, where Tanzler was held to answer on the charge, but was released and the case was dropped due to statute of limitations. Meanwhile, Elena was put through another autopsy to see if the rumors of necromantic sin held any truth. Nothing of note was revealed at the time, and her body was then put on display at the Dean Lopez Funeral Home, where it was viewed by thousands before she was reburied in an unmarked secret grave in the Key West Cemetery to prevent further tampering. Public opinion at the time was actually in favor of Carl Tanzler, with most saying that he was simply an eccentric romantic. With Carl being of sound mind, do you think this could be the case? Or was he simply a sick man that was obsessed with a woman that hardly felt the same about him, and he knew this is the only way that he could have her? Over 30 years later, claims from 2 of the physicians that attended the 1940 autopsy of Elena's remains would recall that there had been a tube inserted into Elena's vagina, allowing for intercourse. Many of the other physicians that attended the autopsy could not recall such a detail, so the claims were largely thrown out the window. Whether these physicians were telling the truth or not, or some were making up stories to paint a picture of something that they wanted to believe, or to feed into the rumors, is unknown. After his release, Carl Tanzler moved to Pasco County, Florida, which was close to his original home and family that he had abandoned in Zephyr Hills. He must have repaired some of his relationship with his still currently legal wife, Doris, because allegedly she supported him during his later years in life. In 1947, Tanzler wrote an autobiography that was published in a pulp publication titled Fantastic Adventures, and 3 years later, he was granted United States citizenship in Tampa, Florida. Up until his death on July 3, 1952, at the age of 75, rumors never stopped circulating around Carl Tanzler. Rumors that he had used the death mask to create a life-size effigy of Elena had surfaced, and some say that Tanzler was found dead in the effigy's arms, but his obituary reported that he was found on the floor behind one of his organs inside his home. But interestingly enough, the obituary states that there was, quote, a metal cylinder on a shelf above a table. In it, wrapped in silken cloth and robe, was a waxen image. Could this have been a small wax idol created in Elena's likeness? One final rumor about Carl and Elena is that Carl actually had Elena's real corpse switched with a fake one before she was to be buried a second time, and that Carl actually was in possession of Elena's corpse until the time of his death. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and rating the show on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help us out. You can always drop by and say hi to us on Twitter at chalkoutlinepod, or you can send us an email at chalkoutlinepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, friends.